One of the biggest mistakes people make about empaths is assuming that kindness is weakness. It's a misunderstanding that has existed for centuries. We tend to live in a world that celebrates loudness over restraint, reaction over reflection, dominance over understanding. Because of that, when people encounter someone who is patient, compassionate, and willing to see the good in others, they often draw the wrong conclusion. They assume that person lacks strength. They assume they can be pushed, manipulated, ignored, or taken for granted without consequences. But what they're really witnessing is not weakness at all. They're witnessing self-control. An empath experiences emotions deeply. They don't just hear words. They feel the meaning behind them. They notice changes in tone, shifts in energy, contradictions in behavior. They often recognize what someone is going through long before that person says a single word. Because of this heightened awareness, empaths spend a significant portion of their lives understanding people. They understand pain. They understand insecurity. They understand fear. They understand that sometimes people lash out not because they're cruel, but because they're wounded. And that understanding creates a dangerous illusion. The illusion is that the empath will always tolerate poor treatment because they can explain it. Think about that for a moment. Most people react when they are hurt. They defend themselves immediately. They draw a line quickly. The empath often does something different. They pause. They analyze. They ask themselves what might be happening beneath the surface. They search for context before they search for blame. To an outside observer, this can look like weakness. But imagine how much strength it actually takes to remain calm when you're misunderstood. Imagine how much discipline it takes to respond with understanding when someone is responding with hostility. Imagine how much emotional control is required to absorb disappointment without immediately striking back. That isn't weakness. That's emotional endurance. The problem is that manipulative people often mistake emotional endurance for unlimited tolerance. They see the empath's willingness to forgive and assume there are no boundaries. They interpret patience as permission. They mistake compassion for dependence. And that is where the trouble begins. Because every relationship operates on an invisible balance. Trust is built through consistency. Respect is built through behavior. Appreciation is built through recognition. When one person continues taking while the other continues giving, that balance starts to collapse. The empath may not complain right away. They may not create dramatic confrontations. They may not demand attention. But something important is happening beneath the surface. They're paying attention. Every broken promise is noticed. Every act of disrespect is remembered. Every manipulation is felt. Not because the empath is keeping score in a vindictive way, but because human beings naturally track patterns. And empaths are often exceptionally skilled at recognizing patterns. They notice when words stop matching actions. They notice when effort becomes one-sided. They notice when loyalty is expected but not reciprocated. The person causing the damage often believes there's getting away with it because there is no immediate reaction. But silence should never be confused with ignorance. Some of the most perceptive people in the world are also the quietest. This is why hurting an empath is so different from hurting someone who reacts impulsively. The impulsive person may explode immediately and then calm down later. The empath often does the opposite. They remain calm while gathering information. They observe, they process, they evaluate, and every experience becomes part of a larger picture. Over time, a realization begins to form. The empath starts recognizing that their compassion is being used against them. They begin understanding that their kindness is not being valued, but exploited. They see that the very qualities that make them extraordinary are being treated as weaknesses by people who don't understand them. That realization changes everything, because empathy does not mean a lack of standards. Compassion does not mean the absence of boundaries. Understanding someone does not obligate you to tolerate their behavior forever. This is one of the most important psychological truths people can learn. You can understand why someone hurts others and still refuse to let them hurt you. You can recognize another person's pain without becoming responsible for carrying it. You can be compassionate without becoming a sacrifice. The mature empath eventually learns this lesson. They learn that protecting their peace is not selfish. They learn that saying no is not cruelty. They learn that boundaries are not walls designed to keep people out. They are filters designed to protect what matters. And once that lesson is learned, the dynamic changes forever. The people who once viewed the empath as weak suddenly discover that the person they underestimated possessed tremendous inner strength all along. They realize that kindness was never submission, patience was never helplessness, compassion was never permission. It was a choice. And the moment that choice is withdrawn, everything begins to change. Remember this: the strongest people are often not the loudest, the toughest, or the most intimidating. Sometimes, the strongest person in the room is the one who could hurt others, but chooses understanding instead. The danger comes when that understanding is mistaken for weakness, because nothing is more powerful than a kind person who finally recognizes their own worth. Once an empath begins to recognize their own value, something subtle but incredibly important starts to happen. They stop looking at individual incidents and start looking at patterns. And this is where the story takes a turn that many people never see coming. Most people assume that when an empath is hurt, they'll simply leave. But that's not usually how it works. In fact, one of the defining characteristics of an empath is their willingness to stay longer than most people would. They believe in growth. They believe in second chances. They believe that people can change if they're given enough understanding, enough patience, enough support. That's why empaths are often among the last people to give up on someone. When they see harmful behavior, they don't immediately jump to conclusions. They ask questions. They search for context. They try to understand what pain, insecurity, fear, or unresolved trauma might be driving that behavior. Their first instinct is often to heal rather than to condemn. On the surface, this seems like a beautiful quality, and it is. But it also comes with a hidden cost. Because every time an empath explains away behavior that should be confronted, they absorb a little more disappointment. Every time they forgive a promise that isn't kept, they carry a little more emotional weight. Every time they choose understanding over accountability, they invest more energy into a relationship that may not be investing the same energy back. What makes this process so dangerous is that it happens gradually. Nobody wakes up one morning completely detached from someone they deeply care about. The emotional separation begins long before the physical separation, and most people never notice it happening. They assume that because the empath is still present, everything is fine. Because the empath is still answering messages, still showing up, still listening, still caring, they believe nothing has changed. But beneath the surface, everything is changing. Imagine a glass being filled one drop at a time, one disappointment, one betrayal, one broken promise, one selfish decision, one moment of disrespect. None of these moments seem large enough by themselves to end a relationship. In fact, each one appears manageable, forgivable, explainable. But human beings aren't affected only by individual events. We are affected by accumulation. Psychologically, repeated emotional injuries create a pattern of expectation. The mind begins predicting future outcomes based on past experiences. Trust starts weakening. Hope starts shrinking. Emotional investment starts declining. The empath may still want the relationship to work, but they begin feeling something they haven't felt before. Fatigue. Not physical fatigue, emotional fatigue. The exhaustion that comes from carrying responsibilities that were never supposed to be yours. The exhaustion that comes from being the one who always understands while rarely feeling understood. The exhaustion that comes from constantly extending grace while receiving very little in return. This stage is critical because it often remains invisible. The person causing the pain frequently assumes they still have unlimited access to the empath's compassion. They assume forgiveness will always be available. They assume another apology will solve the problem. They assume tomorrow will look exactly like yesterday. But they fail to recognize a fundamental truth about human psychology. Every relationship operates on emotional energy, and energy is not infinite. The empath who once fought for the relationship begins conserving that energy. They stop arguing as much. They stop explaining themselves repeatedly. They stop chasing conversations that lead nowhere. They stop trying to convince someone to value what should have been valued naturally. To an outside observer, this might even look like maturity or calmness, but often it is something else. It is withdrawal, not out of anger, not out of revenge, out of necessity. The empath is beginning to protect what remains of themselves. This is why many people are shocked when an empath finally leaves. They think the decision happened overnight. In reality, the decision was being built for months, sometimes years. Every ignored feeling added another brick. Every broken commitment added another brick. Every act of neglect added another brick, until eventually a wall exists where a bridge once stood. What's fascinating is that during this phase, the empath is usually fighting an internal battle that nobody else can see. Part of them wants to stay because they remember the good moments. They remember potential. They remember promises. They remember who the other person could become. But another part of them is beginning to accept reality. And reality is always more powerful than potential. Potential is imagination. Reality is evidence. The empath slowly realizes that loving someone's best cannot substitute for experiencing their actual behavior. This realization is painful because empaths naturally see possibilities in people. They see what could be. They see hidden strengths and unrealized growth. But eventually, they reach a point where they must decide whether they're in a relationship with a real person or with an idea. That moment changes everything. Because when an empath finally accepts reality, the transformation begins. Their energy starts returning to them. Their focus shifts inward. Their emotional investment starts moving away from fixing others and toward understanding themselves. And the person who once seemed endlessly patient begins quietly preparing for a future where they no longer have to carry someone else's emotional burden. By the time the world notices the empath pulling away, the process has already been happening for a very long time. That's the lesson most people learn too late. Relationships rarely end at the moment of departure. They end at the moment repeated pain becomes stronger than remaining hope. And when someone keeps hurting an empath, they should remember this. Every disappointment may seem small in the moment, but eventually, even the strongest heart stops carrying what another person refuses to change. After an empath has endured disappointment after disappointment, after they've carried the weight of understanding, forgiving, and hoping for change, something unexpected begins to happen. And this is the point where many people completely misread the situation. Most people think the most dangerous moment is when someone becomes angry. It isn't. Anger is still a form of emotional connection. When someone is angry, they are still emotionally invested. They still care enough to react. They still have energy left to fight for what matters to them. Anger can be uncomfortable, but psychologically speaking, it often means the relationship is still alive. The truly significant moment comes when the empath stops caring, not in a cruel way, not in a vindictive way, but in a way that is almost impossible to reverse. This is where many people make a critical mistake. They assume that because the empath has remained patient for so long, that patience will continue indefinitely. They assume there will always be another conversation, another opportunity, another chance to make things right. What they don't realize is that every human being has a threshold. Every heart has a limit. Every soul eventually reaches a point where preserving itself becomes more important than preserving a relationship. The empath is no exception. In fact, because empaths invest so deeply, the transition can be even more dramatic. For months or years, they may have been emotionally carrying the relationship. They may have been the ones initiating difficult conversations, extending forgiveness, offering understanding, and searching for solutions. They may have continued believing in possibilities long after evidence suggested otherwise. Then one day something changes. Not externally, internally. And that's why it catches people off guard. There is no dramatic announcement, no grand speech, no emotional explosion. Instead, a quiet realization settles into place. The empath understands that they have done everything they reasonably could. They have explained, they have forgiven, they have communicated, they have waited. And now they are tired. Not tired of loving, tired of carrying. Psychologists often talk about emotional burnout as a state where prolonged emotional investment no longer produces meaningful returns. The empath reaches a similar condition. The emotional system that once responded instantly to another person's needs begins shutting down its investment. The messages that once triggered excitement no longer create anticipation. The apologies that once inspired hope no longer create belief. The promises that once sounded convincing now sound familiar. This isn't bitterness. It's clarity. And clarity can be far more powerful than anger. Anger says, "You hurt me." Clarity says, "I finally see what's happening." That distinction changes everything. When clarity arrives, the empath stops chasing explanations. They stop trying to decode every inconsistency. They stop searching for hidden meanings behind obvious behaviors. They begin accepting what is. And acceptance is often the final stage before detachment. This is why people are often stunned by the empath's transformation. The person who once seemed endlessly available suddenly becomes distant. The person who once responded immediately becomes selective. The person who once fought for the relationship becomes silent. From the outside, it looks abrupt. From the inside, it has been building for a very long time. The truth is that emotional detachment rarely begins on the day someone leaves. It begins on the day they stop believing their effort can create change. That's a profound psychological shift, because human beings are willing to endure remarkable hardship when they believe their per investment matters. People can survive enormous challenges when they feel there is purpose behind the struggle. But when purpose disappears, motivation follows. The empath eventually realizes that no amount of love can substitute for another person's willingness to grow. No amount of patience can create accountability. No amount of understanding can force transformation. Growth must be chosen. Respect must be chosen. Reciprocity must be chosen. And when those choices are absent, the empath slowly releases the responsibility they were never meant to carry. Here's where the irony appears. The moment the empath stops caring is often the moment the other person finally notices. Why? Because the energy is gone. The attention is gone. The emotional labor is gone. The constant understanding they once provided is gone. What was once taken for granted suddenly becomes visible through its absence. This is when apologies often arrive. This is when promises become more urgent. This is when people begin fighting for something they assumed would always be there. But by this point, the situation is fundamentally different. The empath is no longer operating from hope. They're operating from awareness. And awareness is difficult to negotiate with. You can argue with emotions. You can bargain with guilt. You can manipulate uncertainty. But it's incredibly difficult to persuade someone who has finally seen the truth clearly. Because once a pattern becomes undeniable, the mind cannot return to ignorance. The empath understands that their peace has value. Their energy has value. Their attention has value. And they become far less willing to spend those resources where they are consistently depleted. This doesn't make them cold. It makes them wise. Many people confuse detachment with cruelty. In reality, healthy detachment is often an act of self-respect. It is the decision to stop sacrificing your well-being for situations that repeatedly harm you. It is the recognition that compassion should never require self-destruction. It is the understanding that loving others should not come at the cost of abandoning yourself. And when an empath reaches that understanding, something powerful happens. The person who once needed validation discovers inner certainty. The person who once feared losing others discovers the strength to choose themselves. The person who once carried everyone else's emotions finally puts down the weight. That is why the moment an empath stops caring is so significant. Not because they become heartless, but because they finally remember that their heart belongs to them first. And once someone reaches that level of clarity, they rarely go backward. Because the strongest form of freedom isn't found in escaping another person. It's found in no longer needing their approval to protect your peace. Once an empath reaches the point of emotional detachment, something fascinating begins to unfold. It's a pattern that appears repeatedly in relationships, friendships, families, and even professional environments. The very people who once overlooked the empath value often become the ones who regret losing them the most. And the reason is surprisingly simple. Human beings are remarkably poor at measuring value when something is constantly available. Psychologically, we adapt to what we receive regularly. We stop noticing it. We stop appreciating it. We begin treating it as normal. This phenomenon appears everywhere in life. People stop appreciating their health until they become sick. They stop appreciating time until they run out of it. They stop appreciating loyalty until they experience betrayal. The same thing happens with empaths. When an empath is present, their contributions often become invisible. Not because those contributions are small, but because they are consistent. Think about what an empath typically provides. They listen when others are overwhelmed. They notice emotional shifts before anyone says a word. They offer encouragement during difficult moments. They create psychological safety. They absorb tension. They help people feel understood. They remember details that others forget. They support others through challenges without demanding recognition for it. These qualities don't usually arrive with fanfare. They don't announce themselves. They don't demand applause. Because of that, many people fail to recognize how much stability the empath is quietly creating in their lives. It's similar to oxygen. You rarely think about it while you have it. You think about it the moment it's gone. This is why the loss of an empath often creates a delayed reaction. At first, the person who took them for granted may feel little difference. In some cases, they may even feel relieved. There are no more difficult conversations. No one is holding up a mirror to their behavior. No one is asking them to grow. No one is encouraging accountability. Everything seems easier. For a while. But eventually, reality begins revealing itself. The emotional support that once seemed ordinary is no longer there. The understanding that once appeared endless is gone. The patience that once absorbed mistakes has disappeared. And suddenly, the environment feels different. The silence becomes noticeable. The absence becomes noticeable. The loss becomes noticeable. This is where regret often begins. What's interesting is that regret is rarely caused by losing what was convenient. Regret is usually caused by losing what was meaningful. People rarely spend years thinking about things that held little value. They think about the opportunities they failed to appreciate. They think about the people who genuinely cared. They think about the moments they took for granted because they assumed those moments would always be available. The empath often becomes one of those realizations, because once they're gone, comparisons start happening. The person who once received endless understanding begins encountering relationships built on conditions. The person who once received patience begins encountering judgment. The person who once received genuine care begins discovering how rare genuine care actually is. And that's when the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. The empath wasn't perfect. No human being is. But they brought something into the relationship that many people underestimate until they forpeer. Emotional depth. Depth is rare. Many relationships operate at the surface level. Conversations remain transactional. Interactions remain predictable. People exchange information without truly connecting. Empaths bring something different. They make people feel seen. And being truly seen is one of the deepest human needs that exists. Philosophers have explored this idea for centuries. Beneath our desire for success, recognition, and achievement lies a simpler desire: to be understood, to be recognized, to feel that another person genuinely understands who we are beneath the masks we wear. Empaths often provide that experience naturally. That's why their absence leaves such a profound impact. When they're gone, people don't just miss what the empath did. They miss how the empath made them feel. And there is an important distinction there. People often forget words. They forget conversations. They forget specific events. But they rarely forget emotional experiences. The feeling of being accepted. The feeling of being supported. The feeling of being understood. Those experiences linger long after details fade away. This is why regret tends to arrive late. It takes time for emotional comparisons to form. It takes time for reality to expose what was once hidden. It takes time for someone to recognize that the person they underestimated was contributing far more than they realized. By the time that realization arrives, however, another truth often emerges. The empath has moved on, not necessarily to another relationship, not necessarily to another person, but to another version of themselves. The version that no longer waits to be appreciated. The version that no longer seeks validation from people who couldn't recognize their value. The version that has learned the difference between being needed and being valued. And that's where regret becomes particularly painful. Because regret is often the recognition of a lesson that arrived too late. The opportunity existed. The warnings existed. The chances existed. But appreciation never arrived until absence created perspective. This isn't about punishment. It's about consequence. Every action creates a result. Every relationship creates a pattern. and every choice to ignore, neglect, or take someone for granted eventually produces an outcome. The empath doesn't have to seek revenge. Life often delivers the lesson naturally, because sooner or later, people discover that loyalty is rare, understanding is rare, emotional intelligence is rare, and genuine compassion is rare. And when they finally understand how rare those qualities are, they also understand how rare the empath was. The lesson is simple but profound. Never wait until someone's absence teaches you the value of their presence. The people who matter most are often the ones quietly making your life better every day. And by the time you recognize their worth, they may have already learned theirs. After all the disappointment, the detachment, and the regret that others often experience too late, we arrive at perhaps the most misunderstood part of the entire journey. This is the point where many people expect the empath to remain wounded. They expect the empath to stay stuck in the pain. They expect the heartbreak, betrayal, or neglect to define the rest of their story. But that's usually not what happens. In fact, what often happens is far more powerful. The very experiences that seem determined to break the empath become the experiences that transform them. This is where people make another critical mistake. They assume the empath's greatest response will be revenge. They imagine anger, resentment, or some elaborate attempt to make others feel the same pain they caused. But genuine transformation operates on a different level. The empath eventually realizes something that changes the direction of their entire life. They realize that the most valuable energy they possess is attention. Where attention goes, life follows. For years, they may have invested enormous amounts of attention into understanding other people. They studied emotions, analyzed behavior, anticipated needs, and carried responsibilities that were never truly theirs. They became experts at reading everyone around them while often neglecting themselves. Then one day, that attention begins to move, not toward revenge, toward growth. This shift is profound because it represents a complete change in psychological orientation. Instead of asking, "Why did they treat me this way?" the empath begins asking, "What can I become because of this experience?" That question creates power. The first question keeps someone trapped in the past. The second question creates a future. Psychologically, this is the moment the empath stops seeing themselves as a victim of circumstances and starts seeing themselves as the author of their next chapter. That doesn't mean the pain disappears overnight. It doesn't. Growth is rarely dramatic when you're living through it. Most transformations happen quietly. They happen in small decisions, repeated consistently over time. The empath begins setting boundaries they once feared setting. They begin saying no without apologizing for it. They begin protecting their energy instead of giving it away indiscriminately. They begin choosing relationships based on mutual respect rather than emotional obligation. These changes may seem simple from the outside, but internally they represent an entirely new philosophy of life. Because boundaries are not just behavioral tools. They are declarations of self-worth. Every healthy boundary communicates the same message: I recognize my value, and I refuse to participate in situations that require me to forget it. For many empaths, this lesson takes years to fully understand. They often grow up believing that love means sacrifice, that loyalty means endurance, that compassion means unlimited availability. But eventually they discover a deeper truth. Love without self-respect becomes self-abandonment. Loyalty without boundaries becomes exploitation. Compassion without wisdom becomes self-destruction. And once those realizations take root, the empath begins changing in ways that surprise everyone around them, including themselves. The person who once sought external validation begins finding confidence internally. The person who once feared rejection begins recognizing that rejection is often redirection. The person who once measured their worth by how much they could give begins understanding that their worth was never dependent on what they provided to others. This is where genuine confidence emerges. Not arrogance, not superiority, certainty. The quiet certainty that comes from knowing who you are. Many people misunderstand confidence because they associate it with dominance or attention. Real confidence is much quieter than that. Real confidence is the ability to remain grounded, regardless of whether others approve of you. The empath eventually develops this quality because suffering teaches lessons that comfort never can. Pain forces reflection. Disappointment forces clarity. Loss forces growth. The experiences that once felt unfair become sources of wisdom, and wisdom is one of the most valuable outcomes of hardship.